Good day, guys. In this video, I'd like to address some common anti-MGTOW arguments and my impression of those arguments. And I also want to discuss an overall kind of determination that I've made about the goal of these kinds of arguments that I'm going to talk about. So, the first example of an anti-MGTOW argument that I want to talk about here is the just shut up and go your own way argument. Right? Normally that takes a pretty clear form of, well, you can go your own way and you can do your own thing, but why do you have to tell other people about it? Why do you have to try to convince other people that they need to do what you want to do? Why can't you just do your own thing and not talk about it? So the first and most obvious problem with that argument, or flaw with that argument, is that this wouldn't be considered valid for any other topic. Well, why don't you take your opinion on this political issue and just not talk about it, right? I guess you see that sometimes in cases of trying to silence one group of people, like women will say this in terms of abortion rights to men. Oh, just shut up, you're not a woman. So you do see that occasionally with some very specific issues, but for the most part, people would see right through this if it were about anything else. Well, you can have your opinion on gun rights, but why do you need to talk about guns? Why can't you just keep it to yourself? Or you can have an opinion on this voting rights legislation, but no one else needs to hear about it. Like, it wouldn't make sense anywhere else. So why would it make sense in regard to talking about MGTOW or men's issues, right? The idea of, well, I don't believe that marriage is good for men today. I don't believe that having children that can be so easily taken from you in the court system if you do it in the conventional way, with a woman trying to make a family unit, if that can be so easily undone and taken away from you, I don't believe that that's a good idea for myself, and I don't recommend marriage to men. Well, you just shut up. Don't talk about that. Mainly what that indicates is a lack of ability to argue against the points that MGTOW make, or a lack of willingness, either that or a lack of willingness to even listen to the relevant concerns because the person just doesn't care. If you can make an argument against somebody's points of view, you don't just tell them to shut up and not talk about it. That's the bottom line with that type of argument or that type of statement. The real meaning when people say something like that, just shut up and don't talk about going your own way, just go ahead and do it for yourself, we don't want to hear from you anymore. The real meaning, the real purpose is to silence any discussion so that other men won't decide that they agree with a going your own way type of philosophy and are interested in learning more about it, right? Other men can't figure out this bigger picture, or maybe they can themselves, but they're less likely to if they're not being influenced by men going their own way or by someone that's sympathetic to that point of view or is living that sort of lifestyle. Basically, it's just an attempt to stop MGTOW from spreading so that other men don't have as much of an opportunity to figure out what their circumstances are and how going their own way might be an option for them. A second example of an anti-MGTOW argument that I hear pretty often is the you can't reject 50% of the population argument, right? You can't just reject all women. You can't put all women into the same category. Not all women are the same. Nawal is a very similar argument to this as well. It's a little bit more specific, but you can't just turn your back on 50% of the population and say that you don't want to have anything to do with them because they're all women, and you want to hold what one woman did against all women together, right? That's not fair. That's sexist, or maybe they don't use the sexist card necessarily, but it's just the idea that you can't hold women accountable for what other women have done. Well, the problem with that is that MGTOW, or the idea of going your own way, is actually about rejecting the vast majority of people anytime that you can't have a reciprocal relationship with someone. So it's not about rejecting women per se. It's about rejecting the vast majority of people altogether. It's about rejecting anybody being in your life in a significant way if that person isn't willing to have reciprocity with you, if that person doesn't have your back, if that person's only using you as a means to an end, which a lot of MGTOW guys, of course, have figured out that that's how most of society and the vast majority of women indeed see them as just a means to an end, it's a rejection of this. I'm not going to have you as part of my personal life. I'm not going to have you as part of my circle of people if you can't show that you're actually going to have my back, or that I can actually count on you the same way that I would do for other people. So it's not about rejecting 50% of the population, as in all women. It's about rejecting 90% of the population, the vast majority of women, or you can affix whatever percentage you think is appropriate, depending on what the individual guy going his own way decides. But ultimately, it's not about just rejecting women. It's about rejecting most people around you, because most people around you, when you understand where things stand between men and women and for men in general, most people around you are not going to have your best interests in mind. They're going to see you as a means to an end. And if you don't want that, MGTOW guys have figured out that you're better off just rejecting most people, including the vast majority of women, so that you can be free from that type of or level of exploitation. Right? It's not necessarily a complete rejection of all women from your life, but on turning away from anybody that doesn't offer this reciprocal benefit. And unfortunately, this is going to include the vast majority of women, given the present circumstances, but it's also going to include most of the men probably around you, depending on what environment you find yourself in. MGTOW is a rejection of usury in a society where exploiting men is commonplace and even expected by most people. The third argument that I want to bring up that's commonly used against MGTOW ideas is the "you can't get a woman anyway" argument. That you can't get laid, so that's why you're going your own way. You're being sent your own way, right? You're not really doing it yourself. Now, it is true that a lot of guys, as others have said in the past, I think it was Barbarossa that said this originally, which is that men are one BJ away from going back to the plantation. A lot of guys that consider themselves to be MGTOW. And that's probably true, to be fair. So I'm not saying that a lot of guys, if they could readily get laid, would embrace the MGTOW philosophy off the bat without realizing some of the core stuff that they need to do to protect themselves from women that are vindictive against them, or maybe on purpose get pregnant with them or whatever. A lot of guys that do think with their little head are or would go back to just trying to score with women if they could, and they say, well, I'm MGTOW because I don't want to go ahead and admit that I'm really just not able to get sex from a woman. I agree that there is that element at play, but that's not really what the whole "you can't get laid" argument implies. If you can't get laid, if a woman doesn't want to sleep with you, and you're looking at this from a rational perspective, you're thinking with your big head, then why does it matter whether you can get laid? How does that change the actual assessment of whether going your own way is the best choice for you? Because if women don't like you and you can't get laid, then there's even less of a reason to want to deal with women, right? There's nothing positive that they're going to do for you in all likelihood then. When you add in all the other stuff with the dangers and general sort of negativity around getting married today, having kids, living with a woman, and then you put that together with a, well, you can't get sex anyway, then what is it that women are going to do for you that's positive? If you truly can't get laid, which, again, the whole idea of incels not being able to get laid when if they had a couple $100, they probably could if they could find the right neighborhood. And I think you all probably know what I mean by that. It's not a novel concept to talk about what makes an incel. If he has some money, he can probably find somebody. But ultimately, the only valid point that's made by telling men that they can't get laid is to remain aware of the bigger picture if any women are sexually interested in you. Because if they're not, that actually makes it more straightforward. That actually makes things even simpler in terms of just saying, well, if I can't get a woman, then why do I need to try to attract a woman? Why do I need to essentially build myself up to get a woman? If I truly can't get laid, then it's a lost cause anyway, right? So why not just focus on myself and my own well-being and the things that are important to me in my life? essentially, why not go your own way? Why not have a MGTOW type of philosophy? But of course, the real reason for this whole "you can't get a woman" argument is a way to appeal to a man's sense of pride and to shame him into not considering a MGTOW point of view. That's the real reason behind that. It's not to actually point out, well, you can't actually get sex or that level of intimacy or companionship from a woman. It's actually just about trying to make a man feel bad so that he tries instead to say, I can get laid. I'll work on myself. I'll continue to do what women want. I'll continue to kiss their asses. I'll continue to participate in a conventional way in the overall dynamic between men and women today. That's the goal, is to get men to not consider a MGTOW point of view so that they'll go back to doing what essentially women and society as a whole and all the other interests that don't want men to actually think with their big heads, all those powers that be, to get those men back in line. That's the real goal, by shaming them and appealing to their sense of pride. Because if you really can't get laid from a woman, if you can't get a woman to sleep with you, then that's even less of a reason to want to put up with them and deal with most women or pretty much all women at that point around you. So guys, I want to talk about the overall conclusions that we can reach, or I think we can reach, from a lot of these anti-MGTOW arguments that we see, and sort of the main reason why I wanted to illustrate this, aside from just going through some of the more prominent arguments or more popular arguments against MGTOW. So the primary conclusion that I've reached is that most of these arguments, many of these arguments that are made against MGTOW that include shaming and personal attacks, they're centered around trying to create confusion and obfuscation in a man's cost-benefit analysis. Many women and a lot of men, if we're being honest, know that forming committed relationships is a horrible deal for men in this society. Getting married, trying to have a family, even living with a woman, given what the domestic violence laws are, with the Duluth model in mind, these things are not healthy for men, right? These are very dangerous situations that men over the long run can put themselves in. And for what? So that, you can see your kid every other weekend, or so that you can have a false accusation made against you, or so that she can divorce you and take half your stuff. Really, there's very little value there. And a lot of people at some level, especially women, but a lot of men too, they know that this is not a good deal for men. They also know that they have too much to lose if any significant proportion of men, especially those men of high wealth and status, figure this stuff out and choose to live a MGTOW type of lifestyle. And so as a result, many of these people that essentially support a female-centric system, a gynocentric system, many of them choose deliberately to create confusion and be intentionally dishonest about the high costs and few benefits that men receive in long-term relationships and marriages today. So it's not a matter of starting at something, trying to seek out the truth, trying to figure out, well, we may have a difference of opinion, but what can we establish here as being valid or as being an accurate description of where things are between men and women, and what incentives men have to either go their own way or choose a more conventional route. That's not the starting point. The starting point for a lot of people, I've been convinced lately, the starting point is really, how can we make men confused? How can we obfuscate the cost-benefit analysis and the risk assessment so that men don't put two and two together on this and decide to go their own way? That's what this really is. It's more of, let's use shaming tactics, let's use emotional arguments so that men don't consider walking away from women in society. That's what most of this is. And there are arguments that you can make that says, well, maybe this guy shouldn't go his own way. Maybe he really wants to have kids, and that's by far the top thing that he wants to do with his life, even to the detriment of everything else. Or maybe this guy is such a simp that he can't live for anything other than trying to make a woman happy. Unfortunately, there are men that operate that way. That's not healthy, but maybe they are going to be more miserable without a woman than they would be with one, right? You can make these types of arguments that to a limited extent are anti-MGTOW. But the vast majority of any arguments that I've heard are instead, they're not about trying to guide men in the right direction. They're about obfuscating the risk assessment. They're about confusing men as much as possible, trying to get men to appeal to their sort of baser instincts, whether it's for sex or validation or trying to look like the alpha male. It's about that type of thing instead of let's actually let men think about this based on the evidence, based on where they actually stand with women and make their own choices. Because a lot of people know, and a lot of women know, that this is just a bad deal for men. Long-term committed relationships are a terrible deal for men today. And the whole point, like I say, is to keep all of this in mind when you hear people make arguments against MGTOW. Is the person making the argument expressing a possibly valid concern and actually making a reasonable argument against a particular man maybe going his own way? Or is it a matter of doing whatever that person can to obfuscate the unfavorable cost-benefit analysis as it applies for men? And most of what I see, the majority of arguments that I see against MGTOW, and there are others that you could bring out there, right? The whole idea of, well, you just need to keep fighting for men's rights. You hear that occasionally. You're a coward for not wanting to change the system that's already gynocentric and already pretty much in control by women, right? You'll hear a lot of these kinds of cases that women, by and large women, but also traditional conservative or feminist men, they'll try to basically shame guys or make guys feel bad so that they don't consider walking away from this and going their own way in some form or fashion. And a lot of this, just shut up and go your own way. Don't tell anybody about the truth because other men may decide to do this. Or you can't reject women. That's bad. Well, I reject 90% of all people. Is that even worse? Right? It's not about women exclusively. It's about the society and culture of usury that we have as it applies to men. Most of the arguments that I've heard have no intention of letting men figure this out for themselves, because the evidence, guys, in my opinion, the evidence and the overall situation is so one-sided against men. It's so unfavorable for men to consider marriage, having kids, trying to have a family, even living with a woman, that you can't really approach it from the perspective of trying to figure out what's best for men. If you don't want men to walk away from the system, you can only approach it by trying to confuse men and stop men from thinking clearly about these issues. And I think that most of the arguments I've seen made against MGTOW have that goal in mind instead of being intellectually honest.